She was 18 years old and, for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left to speak of, no plan to follow, and just $27 folded into a worn leather pouch. She owned a single blanket, a change of clothes, and a small, perfectly balanced rock hammer her grandfather had made for her. For 80 years, a loaded minecart had hung from a thick iron cable stretched across Black Pine Gorge, a silent monument to the day the Great Northern Vein collapsed, and no one in the settlement below ever thought to ask what it was carrying. But what nobody knew, what Josephine Carver was about to discover, was that inside that ore car, buried beneath tons of worthless rock, was a secret that would change not only her life, but the future of the entire canyon. Josephine's world had once been the size of the smithy, its boundaries marked by the scent of hot iron, coal smoke, and the quenching hiss of steel plunged into water. It was the world of her grandfather, Elias Carver, a man whose hands were a map of a life spent in labor, with calluses like river stones and scars like faint, white tributaries. He had taken her in when she was 4, after her parents' wagon had failed to navigate the treacherous switchbacks down from the high pass during an early winter storm. Elias never spoke of that day, but his love for her was a quiet, constant thing, as solid and dependable as the anvil that stood at the heart of his forge. He taught her the names of things, the ball peen and the cross peen hammer, the fuller and the swage block, the precise shade of cherry red that meant the steel was ready to be shaped. He taught her how to read the grain in a piece of hickory for a handle, and how to listen to the ring of a finished tool to know if it was sound. Most importantly, he taught her that nothing was ever truly worthless. It was just waiting for the right pair of hands to find its purpose again. Broken tools could be reforged, scrap iron could become hinges, and a girl with no one could become a smith. For her 10th birthday, he presented her with the rock hammer. Its head was forged from a piece of a broken mine axle, tempered with a skill that left it hard enough to split granite, but soft enough not to shatter. The handle was ash, shaped and sanded over weeks to fit the exact curve of her small hand. "A good tool feels like a part of you," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "It should know your mind before you do." She kept it with her, always, a physical connection to the only person who had ever made her feel truly seen, a constant reminder of the steady, patient love that had forged her own character. His decline was as slow and steady as the cooling of a great iron casting. It began with a tremor in his hand, a hesitation in the swing of his hammer that only she noticed. Then came the cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the dust of the coal he'd breathed for 50 years. He spent more time sitting in his chair by the forge, watching her work, his instructions becoming softer, more infrequent. He would just nod, a faint, proud smile on his lips as she drew out a length of iron or set a rivet with a clean, sure strike. The men from the town, miners and ranchers, who had relied on Elias for generations, started coming to her for their repairs. They'd speak to him, but look to her for the answer. She learned to mend wagon wheels, shoe horses, and temper drill bits for the new prospectors trickling into the canyon. She was keeping the smithy alive, and in doing so, she felt she was keeping him alive too. He died in the spring, in his sleep, his hands resting on the worn arms of his chair, as if he were merely waiting for the forge to come to temperature. For a week, the smithy was silent, the anvil cold for the first time in Josephine's memory. Then her uncle arrived. Thomas Carver was her father's younger brother, a man who had left the hardscrabble life of Black Pine Crossing decades ago for the cleaner, more profitable world of ledgers and contracts in the city. He wore a stiff collar and smelled of paper and bay rum, and he looked at the smithy not as a place of creation, but as an asset to be liquidated. He was not an unkind man, but his kindness was administrative, a matter of efficient resolution. He saw dust where Josephine saw a history of honest work. He saw outdated equipment where she saw the tools that had built their family's life. He patted her on the shoulder, his touch brief and awkward. "Elias spoke well of you," he said. his eyes already calculating the value of the scrap iron piled against the far wall. Said you had a good hand for the work. But he didn't see the work. He only saw the closing of an account, the final line in a long and now concluded chapter of family history. The end of her world came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of an envelope. Her uncle had stayed for 2 weeks, his presence a constant, low-grade source of tension. He spent his days with a clipboard, making inventories, his neat, precise handwriting, a foreign language in the dusty, chaotic smithy. He spoke with men in suits, who arrived in a hired coach from the railhead, 2 towns over, their polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the dirt floor of the forge. Josephine continued her work, repairing a plowshare for a farmer and shoeing a mule for a prospector. The familiar rhythms of the hammer, a defense against the uncertainty that was settling over her like a fine coat of ash. She knew what was happening, but she held on to a sliver of hope that her uncle might see the value in the place as a living thing, not just a collection of assets. The hope was extinguished on a Tuesday morning. He called her over to the small desk where Elias had kept his records. He slid a document across the worn wood. It was a bill of sale. The Black Ridge Mining Consortium bought the property, he said, his voice matter of fact. The land, the building, the equipment, all of it. He pushed a small canvas bank pouch toward her. This is your share, $200, for your work here, and to help you get started somewhere new. He didn't meet her eyes. She didn't open the pouch. She looked at his clean fingernails, his starched collar. He was already a ghost to her, a visitor from a world that had no place for her. The new owners will take possession in a week, he continued. They've sent a notice. He pointed to a piece of paper tacked to the smithy door, a formal eviction order typed on crisp, white paper. It named her specifically, Josephine Carver, occupant. She was to vacate the premises. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. The quiet dignity her grandfather had taught her was a suit of armor. She simply nodded. That night, after her uncle had retired to the boarding house in the town proper, she packed. It did not take long. She had her grandfather's spare set of work clothes, a whetstone, a small cast-iron skillet, and the blanket from her cot. She wrapped the rock hammer in an oilcloth and placed it carefully in the bottom of a canvas sack. She took nothing else. The tools of the smithy belonged to the consortium now, and to take them would feel like a theft from her grandfather's memory. She stood in the center of the dark forge, the place where she had been raised, and breathed in the familiar scents one last time. It was the only home she had ever known. Before she left, she walked to the anvil, the great, steady heart of the shop, and laid her palm flat against its cold, steel face. It felt like saying goodbye to a living thing. She walked out, closing the heavy wooden door behind her, and did not look back. The $27 in her pouch was her own, earned from a recent repair. She would not touch her uncle's $200. It was the price of her home, and she would not carry it with her. She did not walk down the canyon road, toward the other settlements and the distant railroad. To go that way would be to admit defeat, to join the stream of people leaving the mountains for the cities. Instead, she turned her face toward the high country, following the old, crumbling mule track that led up into the abandoned northern section of the gorge. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with pine, and the clean metallic smell of exposed rock. The sounds of the settlement, the distant clang of a hammer, the braying of a mule, faded behind her, replaced by the rush of the wind through the tall firs and the cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon walls. Her boots, stout and well-made, crunched on the gravel path. The weight of the canvas sack on her back was a familiar burden, a reminder of all she had in the world. She walked with a steady, ground-covering pace, a gait learned from years of fetching supplies and delivering finished work to the outlying claims. She was not afraid of the wilderness. Her grandfather had taught her this landscape, as well as he had taught her the forge. She knew which berries were safe to eat, how to find clean water, and how to read the weather in the clouds that gathered over the peaks. She observed everything, the way the light fell across the sheer granite faces of the gorge, revealing veins of quartz and feldspar, the tailings piles, gray and sterile, that marked the entrances to collapsed and forgotten mines. The skeletal remains of an old headframe, its timbers bleached silver by decades of sun and snow, looking like the ribcage of some great, prehistoric beast. The journey was a shedding of her old life. With every upward step, the smithy, her uncle, and the life that had been taken from her felt more distant. She was walking into the canyon's past, into a place of ghosts and memory. The mule track grew fainter, in places washed out by spring floods or obscured by rockfalls. It was a path no one had used for a very long time. As the sun began to dip toward the western rim of the gorge, casting long, dramatic shadows, she saw it. Spanning the narrowest, deepest part of the chasm was the cable, a thick, rusted artery of twisted steel, and hanging from it, suspended halfway between the two cliffs, was the minecart. It hung perfectly still, a dark rectangle against the deepening blue of the sky, a place where time had simply stopped 80 years ago. On the near side of the gorge, built on a small, level patch of ground blasted from the cliffside, stood the cable tender's shack. It was a small, square structure of rough-sawn pine, its roofline sagging, and its single window, a dark, vacant eye. It was derelict, forgotten, a piece of the machinery of the past that had been abandoned along with the mine itself. To anyone else, it would have been a ruin. To Josephine, it was a shelter. She approached it cautiously, her steps sure on the rocky ground. The shack was anchored to the same massive iron stanchion that held the main cable, a huge riveted pylon sunk deep into the bedrock. The walls of the shack were gray and weathered, the wood as hard as iron. The door hung crookedly on one remaining leather hinge. She pushed it open. A gust of wind swirled inside, carrying with it the scent of dust, dry rot, and the faint, lingering smell of pack rat. The interior was a single small room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet. A rusty, pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, its stovepipe a jagged hole in the roof. A built-in wooden bunk, stripped of any bedding, was against the far wall. In the center of the floor was a pile of debris, leaves, twigs, and the detritus of decades. But the bones of the place were good. The foundation was solid rock. The main timbers, though weathered, were sound. Through the broken window, she had a dizzying, eagle's-eye view of the gorge and the hanging minecart. It was a lonely, desolate place, but it was sturdy, and it was hers for the taking. No one had laid claim to this scrap of land in 80 years. It was outside the boundaries of the consortium's purchase, and forgotten by the county assessor. She dropped her canvas sack onto the dusty floor. The sound echoed in the small space. This would be her home. She spent the rest of the daylight hours making it habitable. She swept out the debris with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. She used a flat stone to scrape the worst of the rust from the inside of the stove. She found a piece of sheet metal from a collapsed ore chute nearby, and, using her hammer and a few old nails she scrounged, patched the hole in the roof. As dusk settled, she built a small fire in the stove. The iron groaned and ticked as it warmed, and for the first time in a long time, the shack was filled with a flickering, orange light and a welcome warmth. She ate a piece of dry bread and sat on the edge of the bunk, watching the flames. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely sound. But inside, her small fortress of salvaged wood and iron, she was safe. The minecart hung in the darkness, a silent, waiting presence. She was no longer an occupant. She was a homesteader. For weeks, Josephine's life fell into a rhythm of survival and slow improvement. She cleared a small patch of ground for a garden, turning the soil with a sharpened piece of wood. She set snares for rabbits and caught small, speckled trout in the creek that ran at the bottom of the gorge. She spent days reinforcing the shack, chinking the gaps between the wallboards, with a mixture of mud and dried grass. The abandoned mine works were a vast, open-air warehouse of materials. She salvaged timbers, lengths of pipe, and sheets of corrugated iron, hauling them back to her small claim. Her hands, which had grown soft during her grandfather's last months, became hard and calloused again. The minecart was a constant presence. Every morning when she stepped outside, it was the first thing she saw. It was a puzzle, a piece of history suspended in time. The townspeople, on her infrequent trips for salt and flour, called it the ghost cart. They said the man inside it, the last man to try and cross before the collapse, still haunted the gorge. But Josephine didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in iron, rock, and gravity. The cart was a resource. The iron wheels and axle were valuable scrap. The ore car itself could be repurposed. And the cable, a half-inch of braided steel stretching over 1,000 feet, was a treasure trove of raw material. The decision to bring it down was a practical one. The project took her a week of planning. She studied the anchor stanchion, testing the integrity of the massive bolts that held it to the rock. She inspected the main pulley mechanism, its iron frozen with rust. She spent 2 days chipping away the rust and lubricating the axle with rendered animal fat, until, with a great groan, it turned. She couldn't simply cut the cable. The cart would plummet into the gorge, destroying itself and everything in it. She had to lower it, inch by careful inch. She used a secondary, thinner safety cable she had salvaged, rigging a complex block and tackle system to the stanchion. It was the kind of heavy, mechanical problem her grandfather would have loved. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, advising her on leverage and friction points. The day she was ready, the sky was clear, and the wind was still. She took her place at the winch she had rigged, her hands gripping the lever. Slowly, carefully, she began to release the tension on the main brake. The old iron screamed in protest. The cable shuddered, and for a heart-stopping moment, the entire structure vibrated. Then, with a low groan, the cart began to move. It slid out from its 80-year resting place, its wheels turning for the first time, and began its slow descent toward her side of the gorge. It took her 4 hours to bring it in. Finally, its iron wheels touched the solid rock of the cliff edge. It was there. After 80 years, the ghost cart was down. It was filled to the brim with gray, ordinary-looking rock. She spent the rest of the afternoon unloading it, tossing the stones onto a pile. When she was near the bottom, her shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It was a flat, metal plate. Prying it up with the claw of her hammer, she found a hollow compartment beneath. And inside that compartment, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a heavy iron box. It was locked. It took her another hour of patient work, with a cold chisel and her hammer, to break the lock. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was a neat stack of papers, a leather-bound surveyor's notebook, a set of drafting tools, and a small, heavy pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. On top of the papers was a sealed envelope. On it, in elegant, faded ink, was written, "For my wife, Eleanor." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was dated the day of the mine collapse. She read it aloud, her voice a whisper in the quiet of the evening. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means that I did not make it across the gorge, but that my final work has found its way to you. Do not grieve for me long, my love. I have lived more in my years with you than most men do in a lifetime. Inside this box, you will find the culmination of my last 2 years of work. The maps show the true path of the silver vein, the one that old Henderson deliberately concealed from the investors and the miners. He knew the northern shafts were unstable. He knew, and he kept digging, sacrificing safety for a few more weeks of profit before he sold out. The collapse was not an accident. It was an inevitability he was counting on to cover his tracks. The deeds in this box are for the claims on the western slope, the ones I filed under my own name. They are worthless now, but the maps will show you they sit atop the richest part of the deposit, far from the unstable ground. This is our future, yours, and the child's you carry. It is a future built on truth, not on the greed that has poisoned this canyon. Sell the claims to an honest company. Take the money and leave this place. Go to the coast, where you can smell the salt air, and our child can grow up somewhere safe. All that I am, all that I have accomplished, I lay at your feet. Know that my last thought was of you, your loving husband, Samuel Keene. Josephine sat on the ground, the letter resting in her lap, the setting sun casting a warm glow on the page. Samuel Keene. He wasn't a ghost. He was a geologist, a man of science and integrity, and he had been trying to save his family. She looked through the other documents. The maps were exquisitely detailed, drawn with a precise, steady hand. The deeds were official, stamped and sealed by the county clerk. She opened the small pouch. It held 20 gold coins, bright and heavy. Samuel Keene had been sending his wife everything he had. Josephine felt a profound connection to this man she had never met. He had seen the rottenness in the system, and had tried to build something true and lasting from it. And like her, he had been cast out. She carefully placed everything back in the iron box, except for the letter. She folded it and put it in her pocket. The contents of the box were not just a windfall. They were a legacy, a responsibility. That night, she did not feel alone in her small shack. The space was shared by the memory of Elias Carver, a man who had taught her the value of honest work, and the spirit of Samuel Keene, a man who had died for it. Her purpose, which had been the simple act of survival, now had a new and definite shape. She would not just survive in this canyon. She would see Samuel Keene's legacy honored. The next morning, Josephine awoke with a clarity she hadn't felt since her grandfather was alive. The world was no longer just a series of immediate problems to be solved. Food, shelter, warmth. It was now a landscape of possibility, mapped out on the elegant, hand-drawn sheets of paper in the iron box. Her first task, however, remained the shack. It was her fortress, her base of operations, and it needed to be made whole. She spent the next week working with a feverish energy. She used the gold coins to buy real lumber and a bag of nails in town, hauling them up the steep track on her back. She framed a proper window and bought a pane of glass for it, a luxury that felt like a miracle. The light now flooded the small room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her greatest challenge was the roof. The temporary patch kept out the rain, but she knew it wouldn't stand up to the heavy snows of winter. She needed to replace the main support beam, a massive piece of timber that was half rotted through. She managed to fell a sturdy pine and trim it to size, but lifting it into place was beyond her strength. She was struggling with a system of levers and fulcrums, sweat stinging her eyes, when a voice startled her. "That's a good way to break your back." An older man stood on the path, watching her. He was tall and lean, with a face as weathered as the canyon rock. He carried a carpenter's adze over his shoulder. She recognized him as Silas Croft, a man who had occasionally come to her grandfather's smithy for custom tools. "You need a lifting gin for that," he said, walking closer and inspecting her work. "And another pair of hands." He looked at her, then at the half-repaired shack. He saw the neat stack of salvaged lumber, the carefully chinked walls, the new window. He saw the work. "My grandfather was Elias Carver," Josephine said simply. Silas nodded slowly. "I know who you are. Knew Elias for 40 years. He was a good man. Taught you well, I see." He looked at the beam. "I'm heading up to my claim, but I can spare an hour." He didn't wait for an answer. He set down his adze and, with a skill born of long practice, helped her construct a simple tripod derrick. Together, using rope and leverage, they hoisted the heavy beam into place. It slid into its notches with a satisfying thud. As they worked, she found herself telling him about the mine cart, about the iron box, and Samuel Keene's letter. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the beam was secured, he simply said, "Henderson was a thief. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it." He looked at the gorge, then back at her. "Sounds like you can." That evening, he shared her simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, sitting on a log outside the shack. He told her stories about her grandfather, about the early days of the mining boom. For the first time since she'd left the smithy, she felt a flicker of community, a connection to another person, built not on pity, but on shared work and mutual respect. When he left, he turned back. "Caleb Vance, down in town. He's the assayer. Old as these hills. If anyone can make sense of those maps, it's him. Tell him Silas Croft sent you." A week later, With the roof of her shack properly sealed and secure, Josephine walked down to Black Pine Crossing. The settlement felt different now. It was no longer a place she had been cast out of, but a place she was returning to with a purpose. She carried the iron box, heavy with its secrets. She found Caleb Vance in a dusty office behind the land registry building. He was a small, bird-like man, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, surrounded by towering stacks of books and geological surveys. He peered at her, over his glasses, as she introduced herself and mentioned Silas Croft's name. "Elias Carver's granddaughter," he said, his voice dry and crackling like old paper. "I remember you. A little girl with coal smudges on her face, watching everything, with those serious eyes." He gestured to a chair. "What can an old rock-turner do for you?" Josephine opened the box and laid the maps out on his cluttered desk. Caleb's demeanor changed instantly. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the lines and notations. He traced the paths of the veins with a gnarled finger, muttering to himself. "Keene's work," he breathed, his voice filled with reverence. "Samuel Keene, best geologist this territory ever saw. I was just a boy when he disappeared in the collapse. We all thought his surveys were lost with him." He spent the next hour examining the maps, comparing them to his own charts of the region. "It's all here," he said, finally looking up at her, his eyes bright with excitement. "Henderson's Folly, the true northern vein. And these claims." He pointed to the deeds. "They're ironclad, filed properly. The Black Ridge Consortium's main shafts are 100 yards from tapping into this. They're sitting on the mother lode, and they don't even know it. These papers," he tapped the deeds, "make you the legal owner." He helped her file the claim notices at the registry, his presence lending her an authority she would not have had on her own. As the clerk stamped the documents, making them official, Josephine felt a shift in her own foundation. She was no longer just an inhabitant of the canyon. She was a stakeholder in its future. Her last stop was the general store, run by a sharp-eyed, kind-faced woman named Maria Flores. Josephine needed supplies: flour, beans, salt, a new lantern. Her gold coins were nearly gone. She laid her purchases on the counter, prepared to spend her last few dollars. Maria had heard the news. In a small town like Black Pine, stories traveled faster than a dust devil. "I hear you're the new owner of the West Slope," Maria said, a small smile playing on her lips. She tallied up the cost. "That will be $22. Josephine's heart sank. She didn't have that much. As she reached for her pouch, Maria stopped her. "Put your money away, child. Your credit is good here." She looked Josephine in the eye. "Any granddaughter of Elias Carver, who brings proof against a thief like Henderson, deserves a little faith." It was more than just credit for supplies. It was a vote of confidence, an acceptance. Walking back up the trail to her shack, the load of supplies on her back felt lighter than air. The town no longer saw a homeless orphan. They saw a Carver, a woman of substance, the girl who had brought down the ghost cart and unearthed a long-buried truth. The official registration of the claims sent a quiet shockwave through the canyon. Lawyers from the Black Ridge Mining Consortium arrived in town, their city manners and expensive suits a stark contrast to the rugged settlement. They tried to challenge the deeds, claiming they were fraudulent, that they were superseded by their own blanket purchase of the old Henderson properties. But Samuel Keene's paperwork was meticulous, and Caleb Vance's testimony as the official county assayer was unshakable. The deeds held. The consortium, realizing they were beaten, changed their tactics. They offered to buy her out. Their first offer was substantial, enough money to allow her to leave the canyon and live comfortably for the rest of her life. They saw her as her uncle had, a problem to be solved with money, an account to be closed. They did not understand that she wasn't interested in leaving. This canyon, this shack, this legacy, it was her home. She refused their offer. Instead, guided by Caleb's shrewd advice, she did something unexpected. She leased the mining rights for a single, smaller vein, one of the less productive ones on Keene's map, to a small, independent team of local miners who had been struggling with poor claims. The lease wasn't for money, but for a percentage of the ore they extracted. It was a modest deal, but it accomplished two things. First, it gave her a steady, if small, income. Second, it solidified her position within the community. She wasn't a distant landowner. She was a partner, investing in the prosperity of her neighbors. With the first payment from the lease, she bought the things she needed to turn her shack from a shelter into a proper home. She bought a new stove, real furniture, and tools that weren't salvaged. Silas Croft helped her build a small porch on the front, a place to sit and watch the sun set over the gorge. The empty minecart, which she had dragged to the side of the shack, she filled with soil and planted with wild herbs. It was no longer a ghost or a monument to disaster. It was a garden. People in town now greeted her by name. "Morning, Josephine." Miners would tip their hats. Maria Flores would save her the best cuts of bacon. She became a part of the place, woven into its daily life. She learned the stories of the families, the long-held grudges, and the quiet alliances. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she was building. The shack on the cliffside was no longer a refuge of last resort. It was her home, earned not through inheritance, but through labor, courage, and the ability to see value in what everyone else had abandoned. A season had turned. The sharp, pine-scented air of autumn had given way to the deep, quiet cold of early winter. A light dusting of snow covered the high peaks, and the wind that swept through the gorge carried a clean, sharp bite. Josephine sat on the porch Silas had helped her build, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In her hands, she held her grandfather's rock hammer, its ash handle smooth and dark from years of use, its steel head gleaming faintly in the pale afternoon light. The warmth from the new stove inside drifted out the open doorway, carrying the scent of coffee and wood smoke. On the windowsill next to her sat a large, perfectly formed quartz crystal, its facets catching the light and breaking it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was the one personal item, besides his tools, that had been in Samuel Keene's box, a geologist's treasure. She ran a thumb over the familiar contours of the hammer's handle, a tool made for her by a man who had given her a past. Then she looked at the crystal, a piece of the mountain's heart, left behind by a man who had given her a future. Elias Carver and Samuel Keene, two men she had never seen in the same room, from different worlds, who had converged to build the foundation of her life. One had taught her the strength of her own two hands, the integrity of well-made things, the quiet dignity of labor. The other, through a message in a bottle, cast into a chasm of time, had taught her that hope could be a tangible thing, a legacy as real as rock and iron. She thought of her uncle, Thomas, and for the first time, she felt no anger, only a kind of distant pity. He had seen the world as a ledger of profit and loss, and in selling the smithy, he had balanced his books. But he had never understood the true value of the place, the wealth that couldn't be counted in dollars. He had traded a history for a handful of coins. Josephine looked out across the gorge, to the far cliff where the other great stanchion stood. The cable was gone now, coiled neatly beside her shack. The sky between the cliffs was empty, clear. She was 18 years old and had been cast out with nothing but a hammer and a handful of change. She had spent her courage on a derelict shack and a forgotten piece of history. It was the best investment she had ever made.